All right, welcome to today's video. And in today's video, we want to understand what the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron is all about. Okay, so let's start from having an overview of the nervous system. Okay, now the nervous system is the body's communication network, and its primary function is to receive information, process that information, and send appropriate responses to different parts of the body. Now, in order to perform these functions, the nervous system depends on specialized cells called neurons. Okay, so this is the diagram of a neuron, and a neuron, is a nerve cell. Okay, a neuron is a nerve cell that receives, processes, and transmits information. Okay, using electrical and chemical signals. So essentially, a neuron has the cell body or soma. It has dendrites. It has axon. Okay, it also has axon terminals. All right, so neurons communicate with one another at specialized junctions called synapses. Okay, neurons communicate with each other at synapses. All right, so where chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters transmit signals from one neuron to the other. Okay, so a neuron can be functionally, a neuron can be sensory, okay, also known as afferent. So essentially, sensory neurons carry information from receptors to the central nervous system. Okay, so we also have motor neurons or efferent neurons. So these neurons, they carry information away from the central nervous system to effectors. Okay, so functionally, these are the major types of neurons that we have. Okay, so in order to always remember that sensory neurons are afferent and motor neurons are efferent, so we can use same. Okay, so sensory neurons are afferent and motor neurons are efferent neurons. So now that we've understood what a motor neuron is, so let us see how a voluntary movement occurs. So imagine you want to raise your hand. So this decision begins in your brain, but your muscles cannot read your thoughts. They can only respond to electrical signals delivered by these motor neurons. So the command must travel from the brain to the muscle. Okay, so the route that is taken by this motor command is called the motor pathway. Motor pathway. All right, so it's very important to note that the motor pathway is divided into two motor neurons, okay, called the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron, which is the first neuron, carries the command from the brain to the lower motor neuron within the central nervous system. Okay? While the lower motor neuron receives the command and carries it from the central nervous system directly to the effector organs. Okay? So together the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron, form the pathway that is responsible for every voluntary movement that you make. Now, an upper motor neuron is a motor neuron whose cell body is located in the cerebral cortex, specifically the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe. Okay, so its job is to initiate and transmit voluntary motor commands. The axon of the upper motor neuron remains entirely within the central nervous system. Okay, so it travels downwards through descending motor pathways until it reaches a lower motor neuron. So one very important fact to remember is that an upper motor neuron never directly innervates skeletal muscles. Okay, so instead it communicates with a lower motor neuron through a synapse. So in this diagram we have the upper motor neuron. Okay, so each cell bodies is located on the cerebral cortex, okay, on the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe. Okay, so but its axons move through descending pathways, okay, and synapse, okay, on a lower motor neuron, on the cell bodies of lower motor neurons. Okay, so now depending on which muscles are being controlled, the upper motor neuron follows two major pathways. Okay, so if the targeted muscles are the trunk, okay, let's say the trunk or the limbs, so the upper motor neuron then follows the corticospinal tract. Okay, it follows the descending pathway called the corticospinal tract, okay, to get to, you know, the synapse. So if the targeted muscles are supplied by the cranial nerves, mainly muscles of the head and face, muscles of the head and face, so it travels through the descending pathway called the corticobulbar tract. All right, so we are going to discuss these pathways shortly. Now, talking about the lower motor neuron begins where the upper motor neuron ends. So, unlike the upper motor neuron, the lower motor neuron directly innervates the effector organs. All right. For example, this is a lower motor neuron innervating the skeletal muscles directly. So, the cell bodies of lower motor neurons can be located in one of two places. So, for muscles of the trunk and limbs, the cell bodies of lower motor neurons lies in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. While for muscles supplied by the cranial nerves, especially muscles of the head and face, the cell bodies of lower motor neurons lie within the motor nuclei of cranial nerves in the brainstem. Okay, so this diagram shows the brainstem. Okay, and the cell bodies of lower motor neurons lie in the motor nuclei of cranial nerves within the brainstem. So at this point, it's important to understand what a motor nucleus is. Okay, so a motor nucleus is simply a collection of lower motor neuron cell bodies located within the brainstem. So this motor nucleus is not inside the cranial nerve itself. Okay, so instead, the cranial nerve begins when the axons of those lower motor neurons leave the brainstem. So in the spinal cord, the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons are located in the anterior horn. Okay, so their axons leave the spinal cord to form spinal nerves. All right. So likewise in the brainstem, the cell bodies of lower motor neurons are located in the motor nuclei. So their axons leave the brainstem to form cranial nerves. Okay. So the anterior horn of the spinal cord, okay, targets the body, the trunk and the limbs, while the cranial nerve motor nuclei serves the head and the face. Okay, so regardless of where it begins, the lower motor neurons axons eventually reaches, the effector organs. Okay, where it forms the neuromuscular junction and stimulates muscle contraction. So because every voluntary movement ultimately passes through the lower motor neuron before reaching the muscle, the lower motor neuron is often called the final common pathway. All right. Now let's briefly examine the pathways that are taken by the upper motor neurons. Okay. So the first is the corticospinal tract. Okay. So this is the corticospinal tract. So we know that a tract is a collection of nerve fibers in the central nervous system. Okay. So the name itself tells us where it goes. So cortico refers to the cerebral cortex, okay, while spinal refers to the spinal cord. So therefore, the corticospinal tract is the pathway that carries upper motor neuron fibers from the motor cortex, okay, to the spinal cord. So these fibers descend through the brain and the brainstem. So most of them cross to the opposite side in the lower medulla at a point known as the pyramidal pyramidal decussation. Okay, so the crossing explains why the left side of the brain controls movements on the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls movements on the left side. So after crossing, the fibers descend within the spinal cord until they reach the appropriate spinal cord level. Okay, so when they reach the appropriate spinal cord level, they now synapse with lower motor neurons located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So the lower motor neuron then leaves the spinal cord through the ventral roots, travel in spinal nerves, and innervate, skeletal muscles of trunk and limbs. Okay. Now, when we talk about the corticobulbar pathway or the corticobulbar tract, so the name again tells us where it goes. So cortical refers to the cerebral cortex, okay, while bulbar is essentially a historical term referring to the brainstem, particularly the region containing the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves. Okay, so therefore, the corticobulbar tract carries upper motor neuron fibers from the motor cortex to the motor nuclei of cranial nerves within the brainstem. So these motor nuclei contain, the cell bodies of lower motor neurons. The lower motor neurons then leave the brainstem as cranial nerves to supply skeletal muscles of the head and face. Okay, so for example, the muscles responsible for facial expression, for chewing, movements of the tongue, and many muscles involved in swallowing. Okay, so they receive their motor supply through cranial nerves. All right. So essentially, what we are saying is that while the corticospinal tract ultimately reaches the muscles through the spinal nerves, the corticobulbar tract ultimately reaches the muscles through the cranial nerves. So, in order to conclude, understanding the and lower motor neuron becomes much easier when you realize that they are simply two parts of the same pathway. Okay, so the upper motor neuron begin in the brain and carries the command within the central nervous system, while the lower motor neuron receives that command and delivers it directly to skeletal muscles. Okay, so corticospinal tract is the pathway used for muscles of the body, that's the trunk and the limbs, while the corticobulbar tract is the pathway used for muscles supplied by cranial nerves, mainly those of the head and face. Okay, so once you understand how these things are organized, you find out that many neurological disorders and clinical signs become much easier to understand. So in the next lesson, the next video, we are going to build on this foundation by looking at upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron lesions. So explaining why each produces the characteristic signs and symptoms from first principles so you understand it better. So thank you so much for watching this video. I believe we've understood what the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron is all about. And please consider subscribing if you have not, and see you in my next video. Thank you.